On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Martha Carlin. Martha's a really fascinating woman. Her publicist reached out to me a while back. We were actually supposed to do this a while ago, but we were fortunately able to do it recently. It was really a pleasure to have her on. She's a fascinating woman. She has a really interesting story. Her husband was at a certain point, I believe at 44 or 49, diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and that really kind of shifted her life, obviously. She quit her job and she ended up kind of using the research tools that she had to begin researching Parkinson's, what it was, its origins, its treatments. And it really started her on this beautiful quest of looking at things in a more holistic way, and especially beginning to study the gut microbiome. So we sat down and we talked about her background, her story, what she really began to see as the root cause of a lot of the depletion of our gut microbiome, especially in more Western societies, things like the agricultural practices, factory farming, antibiotic use, antibiotics in animals, irradiation, GMOs, all sorts of things. So it's a really interesting conversation. She's done some amazing work. She formed a company called the BioCollective, which is really researching the microbiome. She developed a really interesting probiotic supplement that's based on converting sugars to a natural sugar called mannitol. So she's really done some amazing work. It was a really fascinating conversation. I think and trust you guys will get a lot out of this. She's a wealth of knowledge, and I think we probably could have talked for another few hours, but unfortunately we had a time limit for this. So I hope and trust you will all enjoy this. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good option. It's a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back. Things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. As always, to all of the patrons, to all the people supporting that way, thank you very much for your help. And if you're able to do that, thank you in advance. I really like the idea of that site, which is built on this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's a beautiful way to give back. If you're not able to do that, as always, just helping with the algorithms is really helpful. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, and liking the video. And if you're listening to this on the big platforms, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. Also, I'm not sure when this will come out. Probably when this comes out, we will already be into or potentially even sold out for upcoming plant medicine dieta in the Sacred Valley of Peru in February. But we have 2 retreats coming up after that, both in Europe, towards the end of April in Portugal, and the beginning of July in Ireland. Both of those are really beautiful opportunities to go into this plant medicine work, to experience the learning, the teaching, the healing, this kind of direct relationship that can be formed with a plant. So if you'd like more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So I think that's it for the intro. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you for tuning in, and without further ado, here is my conversation with Martha.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We were speaking a little bit before we started the recording, and I believe it was maybe a publicist of yours who reached out. I was talking to you a bit about the podcast and kind of the themes we talk about. But I think, a lot of this podcast focuses on traditional medicine, on plant medicine. And as I was saying to you, I think in a lot of these kind of traditional or more indigenous worldviews or kind of holistic systems of medicine, there's very much this idea that humans are not kind of islands amongst themselves, that we're in relation to so many different life forms around us. And I think even probably 50, 60 years ago in Western medicine, that idea would have been quite strange for most people to speak of or think about. But I think in the last, especially 10 years, there's really been a kind of a revelation, a renaissance of this idea that our gut microbiome has a huge influence on not only our physical health, but our mental health. And I think there's just been a real a deepening of an understanding of that. I mean, I think there's still a lot more room for us to begin to grow, but at least there's a dialogue about that. So I think you're a fascinating guest to come on. From your bio and a little bit of research. I mean, you've done some fascinating things. Maybe to begin, because I would imagine a lot of the audience isn't familiar with you, but if you could maybe just speak a bit about yourself, who you are, your story. I mean, you also have a really interesting story of what brought you to do the work you do, and just to give the audience a little bit of a background.
Sure. So, actually, of course, your story starts a long time ago, but where I am today really started 23 years ago. When my husband, who was 44 at the time, very healthy, marathon running, and he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, this old person's disease. And my background and training prior to that had been in accounting and business systems. I was kind of a consultant, turnaround expert. And that work involved some early training in really systems thinking. So I was trained in something called transaction flow review, which is a way you look for business risk by drawing maps of everything that's flowing through the business and who's touching it. And you ask questions about whether or not the system is working, and you look for those breakpoints. And when John was diagnosed with Parkinson's, they give you a pill and they say, there's nothing we can do. It's progressive. You might have 15 good years, some people less. It's pretty shocking. And I kind of looked at it. I've always been a problem solver. And I said, this is a systems problem. I need to think about it in the way that I've been trained. And so I started looking at it and thinking, okay, well, what's the main thing flowing through this human system? Well, it's the food that we eat and the water and the liquids we take in. And so I kind of threw out everything in the cabinet and started trying to go back to cooking everything fresh and getting organic food. But in 2002, there really wasn't a lot of, quote, organic food. And so I started to study the food supply and what we had done to the food supply, how we had engineered plants and changed how the plants actually grow and the chemicals we were using on them. And so I really started trying to move away from that and study all these different parts of the sciences. And as that progressed, in 2014, I read a book by Dr. Martin Blazer called Missing Microbes. And I knew from my husband and interviewing, most of the time when I meet somebody with Parkinson's, I'll kind of ask them for their life story. And I knew that a lot of them had had a history of strep infections or taking antibiotics for acne during their teens. And so this book by Dr. Blazer was talking about growing up in the age of antibiotics, which antibiotic, anti-life, how that was impacting chronic disease and the rise of chronic disease. And he wasn't specifically talking about Parkinson's, but it really resonated with me. And I had never heard of the microbiome. I'm like, what is this? So I started studying the microbiome, and I met a young man who had a company that was focused on getting antibiotics out of the animal feed supply, and he was making probiotics for animals, and he was a fermentation chemist. So I started learning fermentation chemistry from him and how all of that worked. And about 6 months later, they published the first paper, Dr. Philip Schepperhans from Finland, showing that there's two different types of Parkinson's. Most people are familiar with the tremor, but there's also a phenotype called posture and gait, where they're sort of bent over like a penguin and their feet freeze. And he could actually divide those two types by the bacteria in the gut. And I was like, Eureka, that's it. I quit my job and started funding some research at the University of Chicago, where I met a scientist who was very much involved in microbiome on a huge scale, from the soil to the human, and learning from him. And he had a son who was autistic. And we started talking about the overlap of the microbiome profiles of autism and Parkinson's. There's a lot of commonality. And during that same time frame, met Dr. Suzanne Vernon, who was a virologist who'd spent 17 years studying chronic fatigue. And there were some overlaps there. And I was like, well, what's holding us back from understanding the interconnectedness of this? We call things these single diseases, but really it's at a deeper level where we're losing something. And so we decided to found the BioCollective to look at the human microbiome and make samples available to research, early research. And so we started to collect fecal samples. So I kind of became the poop queen of, learning about all these microbes. And that was in 2015. And of course, now we're 10 years later. I've learned so much from the microbes and how they carry information. They drive our metabolism. And along the way, actually started looking at how can we put back the systems in the body that we've lost from these really important microbes. And from that started developing a line of probiotics that are functional teams that work together to restore some of those really important functions to our microbiome.
So yeah, that's fascinating. So the kind of your journey along this path started when your husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's. You spoke a little bit about Parkinson's. I think a lot of people are familiar with it by name. They may realize it's a neurological issue. You said there's two different types of Parkinson's. Can you maybe speak a bit more about Parkinson's, maybe what the kind of consensus science is around that, and also maybe from your own experience, what you've kind of seen of that? I think for a lot of people, it's also maybe like some of these kind of diseases like cancer or something. It's something that people are quite afraid of. Like it's kind of this thing that's looming. There's no one knows why it, or at least maybe traditionally people don't know why it's there, how it comes. It seems very mysterious. It can just kind of, like your husband, just one day it's on set, even from someone who's seemingly very healthy. Can you maybe just speak a bit more about Parkinson's, because I think it's something. Again, it's in the common vernacular, but people maybe don't have a deeper understanding of it.
Well, the general consensus, since it was first discovered by Dr. Parkinson's, he did long ago, I think, I want to say it was like maybe the 1800s, mention the gut, but kind of peripherally. So the general consensus of Parkinson's is it is a loss of the dopamine neurons and the dopamine pathways in the brain, and the kind of gold standard drug that they have used all of these years is giving people dopamine. But that actually has some detrimental side effects as well. And since Dr. Shepperhan published that paper in 2014, there have literally been hundreds and hundreds of papers on the microbiome and its connection to Parkinson's. There's also a protein called alpha synuclein that clumps together and aggregates, and that's one of the things that they think is a driving pathology, and it moves from the gut up through the vagus nerve to the brain. And maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, it's actually been determined that alpha synuclein is what's called an antimicrobial peptide. So it's trapping some of these pathogenic organisms and trying to get rid of them. But, part of what happens, I kind of equate it to when you get in traffic and say the highway is backed up and you're trying to get off and that's also backed up. And so it's not moving out quickly enough to get cleared. So there's starting to be some movement to a deeper understanding of how the microbiome is connected, but there's still a lot of focus on dopamine and the dopamine drugs or dopamine they put the two together to try to manage the amount of dopamine that gets into the brain. And that's still really, in my opinion, a very surface level reductionist view that's not understanding the full system of that. And last year, I actually got introduced to a really interesting scientist researcher from Australia named Dr. Barry Ninham. And he's a physical chemist, colloidal chemist. So many different things. He founded the Department of Applied Mathematics at Australia National University and has really worked he's 88. His body of work is really showing that biology is missing a lot of the key pieces of how the whole system interacts. And through work with him, we are actually working on a meeting this coming May to bring in some out-of-the-box thinkers, some people from immunology and the microbiome, and then his background, really looking at how all these pieces fit together in the battle that's going on in the gut and what that's doing to the chemistry of the body. And, one of the interesting things in that process, there's a bacteria in the gut called H. pylori, and that has had a number of pieces of research related to Parkinson's because that organism actually grows or feeds on dopamine. And so people will find that their medicine is not working as well because they have H. pylori and it's eating their medicine, but by eating their medicine, it grows more and it actually produces some enzymes that accelerate the battle in the gut. So, this deeper understanding of what's going on in the gut and how to address it, I think we're on the verge of some pretty interesting breakthroughs there. But, conventionally, it's thought of as a dopamine deficiency. But there's also, over the years, I've had a lot of discussions with people about the deeper, maybe emotional level. So there's some fear-based emotion. Of course, you get a disease like that and it drives fear, but there's often been some kind of emotional upset that preceded the diagnosis. Can be, a death or some kind of major event in your own life that created some level of fear and tension that then starts to drive a physiological change. And there's a really interesting Chinese medicine doctor, I'm trying to think of her name, Janice Hadlock. She has a book called Stuck on Pause about Parkinson's, and her work is around whether somebody had either in childhood, or she said it could be a past life, for people who ascribe to that, that there was an event where there was a feeling that death was imminent, and it initiates this sympathetic nervous system response where they move over into the sympathetic nervous system, and they are unable to get back into the parasympathetic nervous system, which makes them sort of stuck on pause, unable to move, which of course Parkinson's in many ways is a physical being stuck, unable to take the next step or reach for something or move. So it's a much deeper conversation than kind of what the traditional dogma, I think, says about Parkinson's.
So I think one of the interesting things, like obviously labels, they can be useful, but they're somewhat limiting as well. But taking that into consideration, like what we would usually consider Western medicine, I think one of the really fascinating things, and really one of the beautiful things about Western medicine is this kind of like reductionist way of looking at things, this specialization. Like you have someone who really understands one thing, and they're very, very good at understanding that. Um, an interesting kind of anecdotal story is I practice a martial art called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I used to live in New York City, and I practiced, our studio was in Manhattan, in Times Square, which, for some people is like the epicenter of the world. So you would think in Times Square I could get decent, health services. But one night, it was like a Friday night, I was practicing and I broke my nose. And I went to the ER, uh, and I had to wait a long time, and my nose was like on the side of my face, and I was like, hey, I need my nose fixed. And they're like, okay, well, let's get you someone. And kind of maybe a nurse's assistant came out, and she's like, oh yeah, well, okay, maybe we need to do some X-rays or something. And I was like, I really don't think we need to do X-rays. I just need it set. I mean, it's on the side of my face. And she's like, yeah, okay, well, let me get a nurse. And then I had to wait longer, and a nurse came, and she's like, yeah, I think we need to do some X-rays. Like, I really don't think I need X-rays. I just need it set. She's like, okay, I'm going to get the doctor. And the doctor comes, and he's like, yeah, usually we would do some tests, but it does look like it's broken. So I think we can safely say that. But the ear, nose, and throat specialist is not here now, so you have to wait till Monday. And I was just thinking, like, how wild is that? Like, I'm in Times Square of New York City, and it's such a simple thing, like a broken nose. There's no one there who knows how to fix it. And I was thinking about my great grandfather, who was an osteopath, and he had a little clinic in Lynchburg, Virginia. And if you broke your nose, you just went there and he just reset it. It was a 2-minute procedure, and then you were done. But kind of the point of that story was, I think, like a lot of things in life, we're losing this more holistic perspective, this more generalized perspective, which, again, specialization is really beautiful, but specialization, if you're too narrow, then you also begin to lose a wider vantage point. Can you maybe speak a bit about, because I would imagine in your journey, as you were saying, some of these things which we give a name to, like Parkinson's, there is something really useful in that. Like, it's a very specific condition. You can see it, you can study it, but sometimes we lose something when we're not able to also look at a more generalized picture. So I know this is maybe a little bit of a vague question, but what has your experience been like in kind of um, dealing with that more Western medical approach where something is seen in a very small lens versus, I think, what a lot of your work is doing, which is beginning to look at something in a broader picture, like these things you talked about, all of these different things from, is there a connection to the gut microbiome? Is there H. pylori? Is there a deeper emotional aspect? And what that journey has been like for you?
Well, yeah, the reductionist view, even very early when I started the company in 2015, I already had a pretty strong view that reductionist thinking was not how we were going to solve these issues. And I actually was very fortunate. I got invited to speak at the White House Microbiome Initiative in 2016, and they had all the heads of, all the alphabet agencies from the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NIH, CDC, like all these people there. And my little 4-minute talk was kind of about reductionist thinking. And I used the example of a pointillist painting because we have all these experts who have their favorite color standing right up close to the painting their one dot of color. And that I feel very strongly that most of the answers are already there. It's just that we haven't stepped back to look at the full picture of how it's all connected. And over the years, people have initially thought of me as a Parkinson's expert, but through the work at the BioCollective, collecting samples from across various disease and health states, or people who, are not presenting with any present disease, I could start to see these patterns in the microbiomes of kind of what was going on. And I was very fortunate. I have a dear friend now and chief scientific officer, Dr. Raul Cano, who was a microbial ecologist at Cal Poly for about 35 years. And he was a pioneer in using microbes to clean up oil spills. So, microbes can break down things and recycle. I mean, they are the recyclers of the planet. And really started to work with and learn from him. But one of the things I talked to him about was, we're looking over here at the human condition and states of human health and disease. But if we don't go all the way back to the soil, which was one of the areas he had worked on with the oil spills, we're pushing a string up a hill. We've got to go all the way back to where we are connected to the earth and fix the earth, because the human microbiome has been decimated by all these new chemicals and different things that we're in contact with. But the same thing has happened to the earth with all the chemicals that are used in farming, and now they come down in the rain. And Dr. Kano was also kind of a pioneer in something called paleo microbiology. And he had gone back in the early 90s and developed techniques to revive microbes that were basically in stasis in amber occlusions and bring those back to life. And he had a collection of these ancient microbes. And we started to look at those and how we could build teams of those microbes to restore vitality to the soil. And so he started a company called Ancient Organics that has been working for the last 6 or 7 years on studying how these microbial systems that we're putting together can restore the vitality of the soil, which then restores the vitality of the plants, which is your area, that then restores the animals and the humans, because it's all connected in this giant web.
That's fascinating. It reminded me, I mean, that word I think is very interesting, paleo. And it reminded me, there was a few studies done, I think when a lot of these, because I spent a lot of time in the Amazon, when a lot of kind of Western scientists went into the Amazon for the first times, and they studied a lot of these indigenous tribes who really didn't have much contact with the outside world. And what they found was there was almost no instances of kind of chronic ailments, neurological disorders. And I think even at that time, a lot of that was seen even by those people, this is probably 70, 80 years ago, even now, that it was somehow connected to their diet. And their diet was wild foraging. It was, they were getting food from the forest, from the soil, from the earth. They're very kind of diverse diet of even a lot of foods that we would probably consider quite strange and foreign. But And they had very specific ways of processing some of these foods, like things like fermentation of certain plants were a big part of their diet. But, and it also reminded me, you're probably familiar with a Weston Price, who was a guy who was studying dentistry, and he realized that a lot of these kind of more quote unquote primitive societies had far better dental health than Western societies. And he also associated to diet and where that food was coming from. But this is kind of getting back to that idea of gut health, and even a lot of those studies on these kind of hunter-gatherer societies showed that they had a far greater diversity of their gut microbiome than people in the Western world. I think that idea of the gut microbiome, like we were speaking about earlier, people are now familiar with that. Like they have some understanding that it's important to have gut health. People have heard of probiotics. People have maybe heard of like that eating things that are fermented can be beneficial. But can you speak a bit about that idea of what is gut health? What is the gut microbiome? Like what is maybe some of your findings, or more generalized findings that are speaking to the importance of why the gut is so important? What is the microbiome, and how that potentially can affect health?
Sure. So the microbiome is the trillions of bacteria, fungi, and viruses that live in and on our body. And it really functions as our internal pharmacy to maintain our health. It makes vitamins, hormones, neurotransmitters. I mean, things like serotonin, I think 70 to 80% of the serotonin is made in the gut. So many of these really critical things to our survival are made by microbes in our gut. And there wasn't, I think, a very clear understanding of that until recently, except I would say in these older cultures where fermentation is a very strong basis, down through the centuries of preserving food. But actually, one of my favorite little books is a book called The Life Bridge. It was written about 20 years ago, and it covers how microbes actually transform inorganic minerals into living matter. So they can take an element and transform it into a molecule that is living and we're much better able to utilize that element or nutrient in that form that the microbes have produced than we would, say, just licking a rock. So that really critical importance on the human side, but also in the soil microbiome. So these networks in the soil of the bacteria and fungi and how they work together to deliver the nutrients to the root of the plant and also to protect the plant. So they produce a lot of compounds that are protective. So in our gut, if we have certain microbes, they produce some molecules called bacteriocins, and they are like very specific at keeping certain pathogens under control or from causing harm. And so it's this balanced ecosystem. And then we are actually more microbial than we are human. So in terms of number of cells, there was an early debate on, it used to, that initially they said it was a ratio of 10 to 1. I think now they've settled that there's about 2 times as many microbial cells in the human body than human cells. But from an even larger landscape, the genes that make all of these different molecules and control all these different processes in the microbiome, it's anywhere between 100 to 300 times the number of genes in the human genome. So I really think about that as potentially our primary system that keeps us healthy. And as we start to lose that genetic diversity and capability in our microbiome, we become less resilient, just like out in the external world, in the soil. As we monocrop and lose our diversity, we lose the resilience that really keeps us healthy.
So I think one of the interesting things, like for me, so an example, living in the Amazon for a long time, there was a lot of, I think, especially from Western people, focus on, for example, something like a parasite or a virus. Um, you have all sorts of things down there. You have malaria, dengue, chikungunya, Zika, all sorts of things that people are very legitimately, rightfully concerned about. I think often for the Western mind, there's this idea, even in our language, it's almost like this warfare language, like we have to eradicate it, or we have to fight it, or we have to kill it. Um, and it's very interesting because, living there for a long time, like, for example, take something like malaria, very common. For people who don't know, it's usually considered a parasite that's transmitted by mosquitoes. But it's fascinating because a lot of people will get malaria, but then there are some people who don't as well. And highly unlikely that, it was just one mosquito bit one person and it didn't bite someone else. Because if you're there over an extended period of time, you're going to get bit. So I think there's often this idea of this idea that you have to eradicate all of these parasites or something in your body so that you won't get sick. But often from more kind of indigenous or holistic systems of medicine, they don't necessarily speak about eradicating something, that they speak about bringing something into balance. And so often in a more maybe Western medical model, it would be that difference between a symbiosis and a dysbiosis. Like, it is something in a dysbiotic relationship. Even when, from my understanding, when they study a lot of these kind of indigenous people, they'll find, like, take, for example, another parasite like Giardia. A Western person may come down and have a certain level of Giardia and they exhibit all of the symptoms of it. But then you have someone who's maybe been living in that environment for a long period of time and they have a much higher rate of Giardia in their system, and yet they're not exhibiting any symptoms. So it seems like there's somehow a more symbiotic relationship within the wholeness of them. Is that something you can speak about? Like, what is that? What is that idea of harmony or symbiosis versus dysbiosis? Like, what is it within the gut that potentially allows certain diseases or things to become manifest, whereas in maybe someone else it wouldn't?
Well, maybe like kind of two parts to that. So I think a lot of people don't realize over the last 4 years, there's been this accelerated fear of, quote, viruses. Um, Viruses, bacteria, the human genome, they're all made of the same alphabet. It's information. It is, and in the human genome, about 8% of the human genome is what's called endogenous retrovirus. And that is actually viral information that has been incorporated into our genome. And there's been some research through some evolutionary biology work looking at genes in the endogenous retrovirus and their kind of protection against certain pathogens and that sort of thing. So I think that's an interesting aspect that people don't really think about. And that actually could potentially be something where these indigenous populations either have a larger set of endogenous retroviruses, or the balance in their body is, keeping things in check in ways where it is a symbiotic relationship where there's cross-feeding. And that's actually one of the things in terms of how we built our human probiotics and our soil probiotics, is putting together teams that actually the waste of one microbe is the beneficial substrate of the next microbe in the system, and they make these beautiful systems. You can actually look at the geometry of how they're cross feeding, and it's pretty amazing. So, um, with the parasites, I mean, we just don't come in contact with the soil the way we did 100 years ago, and that's where your immune system is getting trained and able to recognize and keep these things out. But we've become this very sterile environment, and our babies, many of for the last 75 years were not breastfed. There's a microbe called Bifidobacteria infantis that breastfed babies, Western babies, have lost, or in large part lost. But if you go to these indigenous populations, they still have it. And when they're babies and they're being breastfed, their entire GI tract is colonized by this Bifido infantis that is training the immune system and keeping everything else out. And when we lose that early training, then we lose that innate intelligence of what we need to keep from harming us. And so we've really lost a lot of the immune system training that these indigenous populations have, because they're so interconnected with the whole system, and we are so removed from it. There's something called the hygiene hypothesis that talks about that, and kind of the overuse of all these sterilization. And you obviously, sterilization helped a tremendous amount in surgery and that sort of thing, when they learned that, yes, you need to be cleaning this stuff so you're not passing, something from one person to the next. But just in general life, sterilizing everything and being afraid of the soil or any kind of microbe is really kind of depleting your whole system. And one of the other problems that we have in the Western world is the loss of the barrier of our digestive tract, because so many things in the processed foods have an impact on this lining. It's a single cell thick that lines our gut, and that's all there is protecting us from what's coming through there. So we need the intelligence of the microbes there that know how to keep the bad guys away and kind of knock them out. And we need the strength of that barrier to keep it from crossing into our bloodstream. And we have a lot of issues nowadays with what's called leaky gut, which is the loss of this very important barrier that separates us from this gut ecosystem, if you will.
You mentioned a really interesting, I think, topic, which is this idea of viruses, and obviously it's something that's quite in the collective conscious right now. I mean, maybe less so than a couple of years ago, but it seems like a similar thing. And again, these are all kind of controversial topics, but it seems like maybe in a similar way, a lot of us have become very afraid of viruses, and to some degree potentially for good reasons. Like, there are certain viruses that can be very, very problematic, even deadly. But it seems like in that kind of same archetype of always trying to avoid the virus, never trying to get infected, with this idea that would somehow make us stronger, when in reality, it seems like what I think a lot of research is showing is that actually by acquiring a virus and then building up the natural immunity to overcome that virus, you actually are teaching your immune system not only to better regulate that particular virus, but potentially to regulate your immune system in general. Is that something you've kind of come across or studied? And because a lot of that is also in the realm of the gut microbiome as well.
Well, I kind of have an interesting story in that category of, I've had my microbiome sample sequenced many, many times. And in a number of the samples, these cryptic clover viruses have come up in my microbiome. And as a child, I grew up in Kentucky. I grew up in the woods. I grew up playing in the fields. There was clover everywhere. I mean, red clover and white clover, and I have both red and white clover cryptic viruses in my microbiome. And I've thought about that a lot. And I have like viruses from beans and tomatoes and different things. And um, a report that I got from one company was like, oh, you shouldn't eat beans because, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, that makes no sense to me. I grew up with these things, and these were foods that I ate, or, we played in the field, with a piece of clover in our mouth. And I just think of that as a piece of information. It's giving me information. And this is actually, I think a lot about food as information and plants as information. And now we get our food from kind of all over the world as opposed to our local environment. And in that local environment, the viral particles, or, some people say there are no viruses, it's a piece of information. It's a piece of genetic information that is coming from our local environment, and that plant is telling us something about our local environment, what's going on with the light, with the temperature, with all of that. And those pieces of information are flowing into our microbiome and giving that ecosystem information. And then that is communicating with our cells and giving our cells information. So there are trillions and trillions of these viruses. So bacteria have what are called bacteriophages, and those are little viruses that specifically infect a certain species of bacteria. And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of discovering all of those. And there's a researcher named Graham Hatfull who actually has, I think he calls it the CPhage program or something. He's teaching high school kids and stuff how to find these and look for new, as I call, pieces of information, because we're all connected through this giant field of information. And, the smaller and smaller and smaller you go, it's just smaller pieces of information. And so a virus, if that's what you want to call it, is just that short piece of information that doesn't replicate itself without getting inside a cell where it's replicated, or inside a bacteria where it's replicated.
So you were speaking about, we've kind of been talking about the difference between some of these more traditional or indigenous societies versus Western societies. You mentioned some of the things that in Western societies that I'd imagine over the last decades, even 100 years, century, have really begun to change. Could you speak a bit more about that? I mean, some of the things you mentioned obviously is the health of the soil, the health of the gut, maybe moving towards more non-localized foods, more processed foods, chemicals in our foods. Can you maybe speak about how some of those things affect the gut health?
Sure. So kind of back to that life bridge and how the microbes really empower the nutrients that we need as we start to process our foods, and even our fresh fruits and vegetables. Many of those are now irradiated, which kills all the microbes on them. And you will find that, say, if you try to make a ginger bug, which is a fermented ginger, if you use conventional ginger, you typically cannot make a ginger bug because all the organisms that were on that ginger have been killed. But if you use a organic ginger root, it will still have the microbes. Like our plants have microbes all over them. And, one of the microbes that I really love is a microbe called Lactobacillus plantarum. And it's all over our plants. It's an amazing, amazing microbe that detoxifies heavy metals. Our strain of Lactobacillus plantarum can break down glyphosate all the way back to phosphate, hydrogen and water. And so what's happened is, as we use more and more chemicals on the soil and chemical farming, we are killing that diversity in the soil. So it's making it harder for our plants to get those nutrients through that life bridge of the microbial web. So even though the plants may look healthy, they really aren't as healthy as they were 100 years ago. You mentioned Weston Price. I have an article in there, this most recent quarterly journal on, we did research with some sauerkraut, actually, some organic sauerkraut that turned soggy. It didn't maintain its structure. And we worked with Dr. Don Huber, who was a plant pathologist. He's retired now from Purdue, but trying to understand what had happened to those organic plants because they were short in 4 of the key minerals that build the lignin structure. And ultimately, what we discovered was that it was coming from the manure. So in a lot of our organic farming, we're using manure from cows and chickens that are being fed GMO feed that has those chemical residues like glyphosate in them. And then that comes out in their manure, and then that manure gets applied on an organic farm. And so it's starting to have the same implications in the organic farming soil that we see over in the conventional soil. And as we do more and more of that, in ecosystem science, you see, I forget what the phenomenon is called, but you have a disruption and the system rebounds, but it doesn't go back exactly to the state where it was previously. It kind of has a new normal. And each time you're disrupting it, you're getting a bigger and bigger change. And you see that also in, say, coral reef ecosystems, where a disruption, and then all of a sudden some tiny little thing that seems innocuous just knocks the whole ecosystem out. And so those kind of dynamics, we really need to start thinking more about our food web as this living web that is fed the nutrients through the microbes, and the importance of those living organisms in the soil. And then, of course, 100 years ago, we were going out and pulling a carrot out of the ground and washing the dirt off of it, but we were getting a lot of the soil microorganisms still on that carrot when we ate it. And now, of course, with the irradiation and the chemical farming, we're not getting those microbes on our food. And then to top that off, in order to increase the shelf life of the food in the grocery store, they use a lot of anti-enzymatic or antibiotic preservatives that kill all those microbes because they're what breaks food down and, again, provides those nutrients to us. But if we start to eat these anti-enzymatic and antimicrobial compounds that are on the quote fresh food, then we're doing that same thing to our insides. We're putting in antimicrobial and anti-enzymatic compounds. And we really need that web of diverse microorganisms to help us detoxify things and break things down so that we can access the nutrients, both us and the plants and the animals. And so there's really this lack of, it's again back to that sort of reductionist thinking where they're not looking at that bigger picture of how that whole web is interconnected, and it's interconnected through that information and through the microbes.
So in the In the U.S., I mean, I think there's some interesting delineations. I mean, when I was began studying this, probably about 20 years ago, I mean that was something that I think a lot of people weren't familiar with was the process of irradiation, especially any food that was brought in from outside the U.S., which a lot of food is. It's automatically irradiated. That was one of the benefits of kind of buying organic food, is that I believe that was one of the stipulations that it wasn't supposed to be irradiated. Also, I remember that time kind of beginning to become familiar with GMOs. And I think, like a lot of things, at the time there was some initial skepticism, but kind of the mainstream narrative was that there's no research showing that GMOs have any negative consequence whatsoever. I think always those things usually need to be taken with a grain of salt, especially when you have those very strong blanket statements like there's absolutely no research showing something like that. One of the interesting things about being in Peru is Peru, I think, is one of a number of countries that have actually banned GMOs. But even kind of like that what you were saying about the anti biotics or anti-enzymes being on fruit. It's one of the interesting things. A lot of people come down here and you get an apple, you buy it at the market, and then 3 days later, it's no longer really edible because it's just turned completely brown. Whereas often in places like the U.S., you buy an apple, even an organic apple from Whole Foods, and 3 weeks later, it still looks exactly the same. But going back to GMOs, again, from mainstream science, that was something that was promoted to be this amazing thing, and I do think there can be potential benefits of that. But like a lot of things, it was promoted as if there are absolutely no negative effects from that at all. And I think, especially from people who study the gut microbiome, it's been seen that that's not true, that actually there seem to be a whole host of downstream effects from that. Like you were saying, when you have something like Roundup, which you're using something like glyphosate, and you're creating something that's making a plant immune to that, but then you're eating that plant with all of that chemical on it. And maybe again, if you did a research, is there an effect in 2 days? Maybe you can't see an effect in 2 days, but what's the effect in 10 years? What's the effect in 15 years? How is that affecting things over time? Can you speak a bit about GMOs? Because again, I think that's a very controversial subject, but I think there is more and more research coming out that's showing that there certainly are effects, and even quite deleterious effects to some of those things.
Well, of course, research is funded in large part by corporate interests. And scientists who try to research some of the detrimental effects have found historically that it is damaging to their careers. So I always tell people absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's evidence of not studying something intentionally because I don't want to get in trouble. And there's a number of examples of prominent science. And Dr. Huber is actually one of those people who has had a lot of mud slung his way from coming out about glyphosate in particular. But so it was originally approved. They engineered the plants so glyphosate is a target of something called the shikimate pathway. And that's a pathway that humans don't have, but bacteria and plants do. And in that pathway is the 3 aromatic amino acids are produced, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. And they are quite essential, although they're called non-essential amino acids because we don't make them. But if you just think about at the very top of that shikimate pathway, these aromatic amino acids and all of the downstream metabolites that they make. So there's about 8,900 different molecules that come out of that pathway. And those are disrupted when you disrupt that pathway. And that disruption is caused by the chelating of key minerals that are involved in all these enzymatic reactions. And it also affects the plants because it binds up the minerals. Glyphosate was originally a pipe cleaning technology for binding minerals, and it binds preferentially, like exponentially. It binds the mineral copper and cobalt, and those are really important to the energetic processes of the mitochondria in plants and also in humans. There's just many downstream effects, and you can engineer a plant so that it can tolerate the herbicide, but there are many effects on that plant by doing that. And the polyphenols are actually in that pathway, that shikimate pathway. Also, the lignin structures. So, what gives a tree or a cabbage its ability to maintain and hold structure in our own body? Collagen requires copper and zinc and iron, and when you start to bind up those minerals, and the more you use of it, the more minerals you bind, the problem starts to get exponentially worse. The other thing is, in the early days of genetic engineering, they used what are called marker genes, and actually they still use marker genes. So they use E. coli is a kind of a workhorse of genetic engineering, and they use viruses as vectors for delivering genetic material. So, not to go like way down that complex rabbit hole, but you're playing with a lot of this information that is interconnected in a very delicate web, and there's a long history of knowing that there are what are called off-target effects of genetic engineering. So, you may want to put this gene in and you flank it with these antibiotic resistance genes, but ultimately there are some off-target effects that change other proteins and other things in either the plant or the cell that you're engineering. So, I personally have talked to Jeffrey Smith, who runs the Institute for Responsible Technology and was a big driver of, people understanding the problems with glyphosate. He was working on some research because now that the microbiome is kind of elevated in people's consciousness, there's a lot of work going on to genetically engineer microbes as therapeutics, I'll say. And in large part, if you really go look into nature, you can find a microbe that has what you're looking for, but you can't patent it. Ooh. Did we freeze for a second there? Well, I can't hear you.
Sorry, yeah, we just froze for 1 second, but we're back now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you can't patent and own something that is natural. But, if you understand microbes and the, vast arsenal of all the tools in the toolkit of microbes, if you're looking for a specific function, you can find a microbe that has that function. You don't need to necessarily engineer it, but the owning of the technology is driven by patenting and keeping other people from owning what you have. And so there's a lot of controversy at the moment about whether or not or how we're going to approve the use of genetically engineered microbes, but they're already out in the environment because they've been engineering microbes since probably at least the 1960s in research and recombinant DNA work. And so that gets out of laboratories, it flows into water, the cat's already out of the bag, so to speak.
Two other things that I think are quite essential in this story, which you mentioned it, but I think maybe people aren't as familiar with. You mentioned the use of antibiotics in kind of farm animals, which eventually then are consumed by humans, and what the effect of that is, and then obviously the huge one, which is the health of the soil, and I think that's something that's maybe not again so in people's consciousness. Like maybe they go to the grocery store, they think they're buying fruits or vegetables or maybe even organic things, but also that food or that produce is still limited by the soil it was grown in, and there has been a huge depletion of topsoil through different types of farming practices, as you mentioned. Can you speak a bit more about those two, the health of the soil, how that affects our health, and then also the use of antibiotics in farm animals, which then humans are consuming?
Sure. Well, in the soil, I think of it as kind of two different aspects. One is the mineral nutrients, which just farming over time, especially if you're monocropping, you are depleting the soil and then using synthetic fertilizers to put back the nutrients. But in most cases, a lot of that nutrient is just NPK, nitrogen phosphate, and uh, phos- nitrogen phosphate and potassium. Um, and of course, there's a whole nother complement of trace minerals that are very important to plant nutrition and human nutrition that are less of a focus in farming because they're not, farmers are not paid for the quality of what they grow. They are paid for the volume. And so, we don't currently have a system that either measures the nutrient, what's going on here, that either measures the nutrient quality of the food. We're just looking at the volume. And, maybe 50 years ago, they were talking about how our soil was getting depleted of these trace minerals and how that was going to, maybe we had 50 good harvests left. So we've continued to deplete the soil in a lot of ways. But if we actually had a healthy microbiome in the soil, they can recycle, break down, kind of bring back the vitality of the soil. And so we're starting to see some changes in the agricultural world where they're starting to look at the respiration of the soil, the microbial population, and its ability to do that recycling, and starting to look at more of these trace minerals and what to do about that from a nutrient perspective. Then you go over to the animals. Of course, the animals are eating nutrient depleted grass, hays or alfalfas or corn silage is often fed to a lot of the dairy cattle now. And a lot of it has, these chemical residues in it, which causes an imbalance in their microbiome as well. Just back to the genetic engineering for a moment, there are even, there's sort of this thing that cows are the problem with our planet with, CO2, which, I think cars are a much bigger problem than cows. But there's people talking about genetically engineering microbes to put into cows to reduce the amount of methane. But I think, again, that's a lack of understanding how that whole system works and the recycling and what that does to our food supply. And there's definitely, differences between a grass-fed cow that is fed on grass all the way through the end of the cycle to one that is, fed in a feedlot on these grains. And of course, grass is light. So, cows are eating light. Photosynthesis is taking light and turning it into matter, and they eat the matter and consume the light. And I actually think about that quite a bit because we live in a world of light and darkness, and many of the things we've done in agriculture are affecting photosynthesis. So those herbicides, they break photosynthesis. The plant stops making, green living matter. And, you just kind of have to scratch your head and think, okay, how can that possibly be good?
Yeah, and then also with antibiotics. I mean, not only in the farm stocks themselves, but also in humans. And again, it's one of these things where it's always a double-edged sword. I mean, certainly antibiotics have been a huge revelation in medicine. I remember I was in this very remote place in Indonesia, and this island called the Key Islands, and I got some infection in my leg. And miraculously, there happened to be a little clinic there. I mean, this place was super, super remote. I mean, you basically
Yeah.
very difficult to get to. But there was this little clinic with this one woman, and she had this jar, and she had 3 penicillin tablets left. And she's like, "If this doesn't work, we may have to cut off your leg." And I was like, "Oh my God!" But I took a penicillin tablet, and the infection went away. So obviously, there's a time and a place for these things, and yet at the same time, in a lot of our medicine, we're being given antibiotics for everything. Like any kind of ailment that we have, we're being given an antibiotic, and especially also then in farm animals, kind of with a similar logic, which we're then consuming. I think more and more there's a realization. I was listening to this interesting dialogue with a medical doctor the other day. Again, this is a very controversial topic, but he was speaking about pro versus anti-vaccine, and kind of the person he was debating was saying, well, look, there is this huge increase in chronic ailments. So if it's not coming from vaccines, where do you think it's coming from? And interestingly, this medical doctor said, well, I think it's from an overprescription of antibiotics, which was, also quite interesting hearing that from a medical doctor. And this is one of the things you mentioned early on, even as a possible link of Parkinson's, which is people who've maybe had chronic infections that they're taking antibiotics. What is that maybe use or overuse of antibiotics doing in the human system that's potentially depleting the gut microbiome and then making us more susceptible to these chronic ailments?
Well, so I think a lot of people may not realize that most of the antibiotics have actually come from microbes. So they may be familiar with penicillin coming from a fungus in the initial finding of that, which was sort of an accident. But fungi and viruses produce a lot of these antimicrobials. Actinobacteria is where a lot of these microbes come from, and those are often soil microbes. And if you have a diverse microbiome, they're producing antimicrobials kind of back and forth against each other, maintaining this balance. But as you start to layer on, taking of antibiotics, it changes the whole microbiome. It changes how, so often they will kill the good bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria that are very important for us. They're those B vitamin producers that we really need. And they make a lot of the hormones and neurotransmitters. So as you get exposed to more and more of those antibiotics, you're less able, you end up with a microbiome that is antibiotic resistant, but that is more of the microbes that actually make the antibiotics and less of the other microbes. And so you've got this sort of out of balance situation. There's some interesting research in cattle showing what happens to the cow's microbiome. like obesity, for example. They use antibiotics in cattle to make them get fat faster. So it can accelerate their time to market. They have to feed them less because that shift in the microbiome actually makes them load fat a lot faster than they would, fat and protein, a lot faster than they would otherwise. And so that's where it really came into widespread use, was in discovering that they could make these animals fat faster, which accelerated their time to market and made them make more money. And there's been a battle over the last, I'll say, 7 years about that. And some of the antibiotics have been outlawed, but there's still fairly widespread use of antibiotics in the animal operations here in the United States because of the way the animals are basically brought to market in these large feedlots. And of course, the more we eat of that, the more it affects our microbiome and selects for, there's a really interesting paper from, I think it was Oregon State, where they showed the impact of antibiotics on the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is our energy powerhouse in our body, but it showed that there was an impact on the mitochondrial gene expression when they were given the antibiotics, but there was actually a bigger impact after the antibiotics went away with what was called the resistome, or those microbes that were left behind that were resistant to the antibiotics, and how they impacted and communicated with mitochondrial gene expression. So I think there's, again, back to this interconnected web of, we're just so very reductionist in terms of thinking about these tools that we have that are important, but we're also accelerating antibiotic resistance in the environment by overuse of antibiotics, which is it is an absolutely fantastic tool for something like what happened to you with your leg, or, in a surgical situation, or, some kind of really acute infection, but they kind of hand them out like candy now.
Yeah. So one of the other really interesting things you mentioned, which I think it is also at the base of really all traditional or holistic systems of medicine, is this kind of mind-body connection. And you were speaking about it when we were speaking about Parkinson's, and this idea that kind of over time, and I think it's something that a lot of people begin to find, which I think is really the basis of any kind of scientific approach, which is this idea of pattern recognition, and that you've kind of began to see that potentially in some of these cases like Parkinson's, there were potentially these patterns in people. You mentioned this idea of like fear-based emotions, which obviously is going to be exacerbated if someone is diagnosed with something, but that there also could be things in someone's life, traumatic events or something that happens that potentially could lead to. So yeah, the question was about, I think, something really interesting that you touched on, which I think in more modern science or medicine is becoming more prominent, more accepted, is this idea of the mind-body connection. Obviously also in our kind of Western medical model, most allopathic medicine is looking at things purely on a physical level, imbalances, too much of this, not enough of this. Obviously, in our Western system, we also have the field of psychiatry or psychology, which does recognize that there's a connection to mind, to potential illness, and I think much more accepted now that over time those potential mental imbalances can have physical manifestations as well. One of the interesting things I think you mentioned, which I think is really the basis of science, is what could be called pattern recognition. And that especially the more you do something, the more you can potentially begin to see patterns that can give you insight. And you mentioned this idea that when you were doing this research on Parkinson's, that you saw that there could potentially be this pattern of, I think as you described, some sort of fear-based emotion. Um, Obviously, that can happen from a diagnosis, but even before that, that potentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there could have been some traumatic uh, thing that happened in someone's youth or as a young adult, potentially around the loss of maybe a loved one, just the idea of death itself, which I think is something that people struggle with. And this idea that that can create some sort of even as you're mentioning that book, that idea of a pause, like there's a stuck energy, which again is in traditional systems, they speak about that that's actually the root of of illness is there's a stuckness, something isn't flowing. Um, and I think always very important to preface this kind of discussion that, I think sometimes there can be this thing where like people are then like blamed for their illness, like, oh well, you caused that because something happened to you and you're holding on to that, and that's not the case at all. Usually these things happen because we don't have the tools to deal with them, so it's certainly not the fault of the person. But can you speak a bit about that idea of recognizing that there may be certain patterns that are correlated to certain ailments that are not just physical, but that can also be in a relational aspect to someone's life?
Sure. Um, I mean, I have two examples. One actually, I recently had a long conversation with a gentleman who has Parkinson's, and we were talking about his life story and what what might have impacted that. And there are a lot of different things, exposures that can have an impact. But he was telling me he actually works in New York City, and he's in the area of the World Trade Center, and he was there on 9/11. And so he was telling me about his experience on 9/11, which I thought was probably very scary. But what he what he told me was what was more scary for him that day wasn't so disruptive as a decision he made after 9/11 to not drive his own car into the city, but to take the train every day. And during a 1 or 2 year period after 9/11, the police would come on the train every day and pull people off. And he said he would be looking in the overheads at these bags that were in the overheads, and how did he know it wasn't from the person that they took off the train? And so he was in this constant state of unknowing and fear and uncertainty of, is this train going to explode? And that went on for some period of time, that of course sets up a vibration, if you will. And just looking at the Janice Hadlock's work on Stuck on Pause, one of the things I talked to my husband about, my husband actually passed away in September of a pulmonary embolism, but so he was diagnosed in 2002, but in 1998, he went on a raft trip down the Gunnison River, and their raft flipped and they were trapped in the canyon. A couple of them underwater, almost didn't come out without drowning. My husband was fortunate he wasn't one of them, but the canyon walls are so high you can't climb out of them. So they spent 2 days in hypothermic conditions, floating down the Gunnison River, and trying to, the four of them huddled together on a rock to get some rest. And he was in this very traumatic, am I going to die situation uh, for that period of time, that I think potentially could have been a trigger, that we hadn't really thought about. And I didn't realize at the time how serious it was. And in retrospect, looking at that and looking at Janice Hadlock's work, I thought, maybe that was the trigger for him, those 4 years before he was diagnosed with Parkinson's.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe kind of Shifting a bit, so we've kind of talked about a lot of these potential root causes, problems that we're facing in society. So maybe kind of shifting to your work, what has your work taken on? Like how are you going about now? Because you've also created a company, you've been a speaker in a lot of different areas. What are ways, I mean, it can specifically be with Parkinson's or just gut health in general and how many things that can affect, but what are ways of kind of moving forward that you see in your work in society that we can begin to remedy these things, to come into more of a symbiotic relationship with this more holistic way of health and kind of tools or practices that you focus on or that people can do uh, to restore their gut microbiome, to be in a more holistic relationship within their physical health, within their mental health, that you feel are really kind of pathways of healing from these things.
Sure. Well, I initially started looking into probiotics when I was working with Steve and learning from him making animal probiotics. But in 2016, I went to a Parkinson's conference, and they were actually talking about the sugar alcohol mannitol and how it could stop the aggregation of the proteins that are involved in Parkinson's. And I came back and bought this little mannitol chemistry book and started looking at what an amazing molecule it is. It's the most abundant sugar in nature. In plants, it is used to manage osmotic stress. It's a free radical scavenger, but humans don't use it like plants use it. We don't use it. So if we're taking in mannitol, it's usually eliminated through our urine or feces. So I started looking at that and found that there were a handful of microbes that actually produce it from other sugars. And so I sat down with Steve and I said, could we like put together a team to put back into the gut our own ability to convert these sugars into mannitol, to help with this problem? And, initially just made it for my husband, John. And within a month, he had some pretty miraculous changes. We were measuring his microbiome and we could see it going back to the healthier profile, a more diverse microbiome. And at the time he started, he was walking with a cane, and he stopped walking with a cane, and he was able to navigate through crowds. So, we just started having other people try it. And people started coming back and saying, my sleep is better, my energy's better, like all of these different things were improving. And so we really started to look deeper at what this team of microbes was doing. And that's when Raul came and joined me, and he had this background in microbial ecology. And so we started looking at, well, what are the problems what are the things that we've lost, these functions that we've lost, and how could we basically put back little mini ecosystems to help restore our own capability within our body to make the thing. So, I say like, make it, don't take it, instead of, taking 20 different supplements. If you have the ecosystem that can make some of these key things, like there's a short chain fatty acid called butyrate that helps feed those cells that line your gut, that helps you have more protection. And we build our probiotics like fermented foods, but you can eat fermented foods and restore a lot of this vitality to your system. There's an Australian guy that Cribben Governor, I think is his last name. He has a podcast too. And, he was having all kinds of health issues and started to look into kefir, which is an even more complex than, say, a sauerkraut. But you have these microbes that work in concert together as teams. And so we're building, teams for the human body. If somebody wants to take a capsule or to use that to make a yogurt or a fermented drink or something, you can use those capsules for that as well. But you can also, if you can't afford a probiotic or you really want to go back to the food, you can get these things from the microbial teams that are centuries old in all of these fermented foods. And, that little book I was talking about, The Life Bridge, has a table in the back of cultures all around the world, and the different fermented foods that they have. And I, I also find it interesting, this connection of the word culture in a fermentation and culture in a society, because the culture is this interconnected, somebody was at my door, this interconnected team that works together. It works well, it supports each other. And when you have these sort of silos, you don't get that interconnectedness that you get with a fermented food or with the way we build our teams of probiotics. And that first one that we made for John is called Sugar Shift. And we actually went on to study it in diabetes and could see what was happening in the gut microbiome. And a lot of what's happened with our loss of diversity, our gut is supposed to be an anaerobic environment, and it has lost that. It's got too much oxygen in it, and that feeds a certain kind of microbes that we really don't want. And through this probiotic, it's actually restoring the anaerobic environment of the gut and enabling the good microbes that are anaerobic to kind of take back over and control the system a little better. And then over on the agriculture side in our Ancient Organics, we're doing the same thing, is building a team of microbes that can actually help restore the overall diversity of the soil. So it's not just about putting in a handful of microbes, but you're putting back a team that's kind of making the whole environment or the whole culture better for everyone. And so then the whole microbial population of the soil, where you may have some dormant microbes, they actually come back to life and you get this diversity again in the soil. And so that's really our goal, is restoring these systems on both the human side and the soil side. And then that's going to come together through healthier plants and healthier food.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminded me. I think a couple of years ago, some people may be familiar. I think it was in New York Times. There was an article that I think was shocking to some people, not shocking to others, but about how maybe it was in the 70s. Also kind of this idea that you were speaking about where is scientific research coming from, but essentially that kind of lobbyists from the sugar industry had done these kind of faulty studies to take away the deleterious effects that an excess of sugar can have on the body, and kind of put it on saturated fat. And that's where I think, even when I was growing up, like in the 80s, there was this fad of like, no fat yogurt or no fat this, as if fat was a bad thing. But I think there's more and more research on kind of the deleterious effects of sugar, because even, I don't know the exact statistics, but 100 years ago, the average human would consume, I don't know, half a pound of sugar a year, and now we're up to like 15 pounds. I mean, it's a huge, huge increase. Is that something you've also noticed or seen that can be one of these problems of chronic ailments, of chronic diseases, and also part of the idea behind the probiotic, which is this idea of kind of transmuting this excess of sugar into a sugar in the form of mannitol that can actually be beneficial rather than taxing the system. Because even talking about these things like viruses or parasites, I mean, it seems like it's fairly accepted now that a lot of these things, like Candida, for example, they feed on sugar. It's actually I just another anecdotal thing. I mean, my diet was, I think, quite healthy. I didn't have much sugar at all, but even sometimes, like if you go to Whole Foods or something and you buy something that you think is healthy, like a kombucha, but you realize like there's, 16 grams of sugar in this one drink, which, according to some people is probably like 3 times your recommended dose of sugar per day. But one of the kind of ancient ways of beginning to learn from a plant is called a dieta, where you kind of go into a direct experiential learning process from a plant. And usually it involves a period of isolation and really restricting your food to something very simple, very bland, like, boiled plantain and maybe once in a while a little bit of fish, boiled green plantain, not sweet plantain. And I remember the first time I did that. I mean, I was literally like manic, like wandering around my little tambo, my little hut, like craving something sweet, because I was going through this huge withdrawal of sugar, and coming from someone who didn't really even think I ate that much sugar. But I really noticed the effect of like how powerful, whatever it is, the organisms in my body were craving the sugar because they were going through a withdrawal. So maybe if you can just, if that resonates with you, that idea of sugar and, also this excess sugar, and how that can also affect our gut microbiome.
Well, I mean, that's an area I have looked deeply into. Of course, our bestseller is this sugar shift. So, I mean, sugar is something that I've actually looked, very deeply into because of this sugar shift. But I think like one of the things in the modern diet is these highly processed sugars, and also what we've done in terms of hybridizing and genetically engineering our fruits to produce a higher level of fructose. So fructose is processed in the liver. Glucose actually is a fuel that fuels our mitochondria. It's preferentially fuels the brain. And the table sugar that we get is about, I think it's 50-50 glucose and fructose. So we now have this much, much higher level of fructose in the diet that's being processed in the liver. And we're also eating fruit 365 days a year. If we go back to thinking about how we lived with the land previously, fruits were only available for a very short period of time. I mean, I think about like when I lived in Colorado and it was peach season, from the end of July to the end of August, we were drowning in peaches, which we loved. But as soon as the end of August was over, there weren't any more peaches. And now, of course, you can get any kind of berries, any kind of fruits from anywhere you want. So we're constantly consuming this excess of sugar. And, the way our formula works, fructose is one of the sugars that it converts into mannitol. And what it also does, I'll say a virtuous cycle. So it can convert that fructose into mannitol, but if you need fructose or glucose, it can actually reverse that cycle and balance it back out and deliver to you what you need. So it's a self-balancing system, if you will. And I think, when we used to have that microbiome diversity and we weren't loading our bodies up with all these processed sugars and, fruits from around the world 365 days a year, we had a much more natural cycle in the microbiome. And there's some interesting research in a group in Africa called the Hadza, where they eat only plants during, I guess what would be the summer. And then in the winter, they're eating, only animal protein. And they have a very diverse microbiome, but it's swinging back and forth with that seasonality. And of course, we've got this constant bombardment of sugar, and it's in if you get any kind of processed food and you actually read the label, you'll be shocked at how many things actually have sugar in them. And you're like, why does that need to have sugar? Well, sugar is also highly addicting. And there's so maybe backing up to some other interesting research that I've learned about recently from neuropsychologists who started out studying brain trauma in student athletes who had had concussions, but discovered so we take up glucose into our brain preferentially. About 70% of the glucose goes straight to the brain in a healthy brain. But with each trauma, whether that's a physical trauma, an emotional trauma, a spiritual trauma, the blood-brain barrier closes down, and when it opens back up, it allows just a little bit less in the next time. So say it was preferentially 70%, the first trauma it drops to 68, the next trauma it drops to 66, and over time you stop being able to get that glucose preferentially into the brain, and that creates maybe an actual fear level emotion that we're not even aware of this loss of preferential ability. And so I've actually been studying his work pretty closely for the last 6 weeks, trying to understand more deeply the work that he's been doing to work to reset that, because basically he says it kicks off this sympathetic nervous system reaction because the brain isn't getting the fuel that it needs. So mannitol actually opens up the blood-brain barrier. It's used often for delivery of medicines, or if somebody has a brain trauma and they have swelling, it can open up the blood-brain barrier and allow the fluids out. So I think there is also a mechanism there with the probiotic making the mannitol and working in that balanced system to help the brain deal with that kind of trauma. But we're really just starting to kind of think about how could we even study that. But our relationship with sugar is pretty complicated. But at the same time, DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid is a sugar. We're made of sugar. So are plants. So again, it's, back to that, the balance of these components that we are made of and we share in common.
Yeah. So speaking of plants, have you done any research or found any kind of medicinal plants to be beneficial? I mean, just thinking about neurological conditions, I mean, some maybe that kind of come to mind, reishi, the mushroom, ginkgo biloba is often used, ginseng, green tea, nicotine. Interestingly, there's been some interesting research on neurological conditions. Are those like any sort of plant or kind of traditional herbal supplement? Have you done any research as to possible kind of incorporating that or benefits from that?
I haven't done specific research, though. We have tried, or we did try with John, a number of plant medicines and also fermenting plants. There's a really interesting relationship when you co-ferment different medicinal plants with microbial mixtures and the metabolites that they produce, and how they can make the plant medicine, if you will, more bioavailable, just like they do in the soil. So that's kind of interesting. And I did some work with Japanese knotweed, which there was some research on the potential for Japanese knotweed. And so I did some fermentations with Japanese knotweed and skullcap. And there was one other one. is escaping me at the moment. We did try a number of different plant remedies, if you will, and I think there were definitely benefits. So, as I mentioned, John passed away in September. That was 23 years into a Parkinson's diagnosis, and he had really had a very robust, healthy life up until at the end of 2021. He had a pretty severe case of COVID, and we did a lot of work, kind of moving him back from where he was with that. And actually, nicotine, there was a researcher that I talked to quite a bit about nicotine and nicotine gum or nicotine patch. And we definitely saw some benefits from that. But I think there's still a lot to be learned about how COVID is affecting the cardiovascular system, and what ultimately happened to John was he had a pulmonary embolism, which is a clot, but he had both clotting and bleeding at the same time. So again, it was that's a very delicate system in the body, the system of clotting and bleeding, where there's a lot of communication that's going on to keep that in balance. It's very delicate, and somehow that got terribly out of balance.
Yeah, I'm very sorry to hear that. Also, yeah, one other thing that comes up, speaking about probiotics, I think that's also something that you spoke about a lot of natural ways of introducing those into the system: kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi. There's all sorts of different fermentation processes. I think for a lot of people in our modern society, they prefer taking something in a pill just because it's easier, for better, for worse. I think pill form of probiotics has become something that a lot of people are working with. It's not something I've done a tremendous amount of research on, and obviously there's tremendously varying qualities of what you're getting. But kind of from these standard probiotics that maybe have a few different strains in them, or some even claim to have like millions or billions of strains in them. Um, do you think there is a benefit to that? But because on the one hand, obviously, I think probiotics as a whole are being seen to be very beneficial. But once you put something in a pill form, like, is it even alive? What is the shelf life of it? Is it bioavailable? Do you think, in general, kind of these standard probiotics that people are buying, do you think there is a benefit to them, or is it maybe not as much? And the real way to benefit of that is something like you were talking about, what you're producing, or going to these more natural sources.
Well, I mean, I do think they are beneficial. There are certainly some challenges with the market today in terms of lack of diversity, because most of the products on the market come from just three major suppliers. And so they're not really addressing the lack of diversity that we have. But your question about, are they alive? So yes, absolutely, they're alive. What happens is, so single culture of a strain of bacteria, so say for example our lactobacillus plantarum, is grown in a culture media, and that culture media is a prebiotic. Prebiotics are what feed the microbes, and so it grows to a certain level, and it's producing postbiotics, so it's producing some of those vitamins and nutrients and things that it does, and then it is freeze dried. So when it's either freeze dried or spray dried. So either one of those ways, when they get dried, they basically just kind of go into stasis. And if you think back to Dr. Kano's work of those microbes that were trapped in amber, they were still alive in the amber, and they could exchange hydrogen gas through the amber. to stay alive over time. So microbes or probiotics go through this freeze drying process, and they're still alive. And then they're tested at the end of that production process to see how many what are called colony forming units. And that's basically how many live organisms there are to form colonies. And so that's what you see most of the time on a probiotic label is a CFU count, which is typically in the billions, and you'll see anywhere from 1 billion up to some products that are, 400 billion. And what happens is then you take them, and with the moisture in your body, they come back to life and, start to do their magic. And a lot of people will say, well, can they get through the gut and the stomach acid? But most probiotics are either lactic acid bacteria that are acid tolerant, so they make it through the stomach, or they are spore formers like some of the soil microorganisms like Bacillus subtilis or Bacillus coagulans. And a spore former will just be dormant until it gets to optimal conditions for it to revive, and then it will kind of do its magic and go on out of the system. So I think for me the big question is whether you're getting a supplier that is testing their CFU counts and making sure that they actually are the CFU counts that they're telling you you're getting, and that they have some diversity in their formula. But really, I think we are the only company that is actually building teams that work together. And I think that's the difference of ours, is we build a team that is very much like a fermented food. And one of our key organisms in a lot of our formulas is an organism called Leuconostoc mesenteroides. And if you look at fermented foods around the world, that is one of the main organisms in many of the fermented foods around the world, for thousands of years. And that is an organism that manages that oxygen and makes the environment anaerobic so that the other microbes can flourish. So we're different in that way. And some of our microbes are our own. We have isolated them from elderberries and different plant material and from the human microbiome. I think really focusing on diversity, and the best way, of course, to spread the diversity is to ferment your own foods from your local environment that's giving you that local environment information. Or ferment your own yogurt, make your own yogurt. So we have, like my sugar shift formula, we have a lot of people who make yogurt out of the sugar shift formula.
Yeah, amazing. I know we're coming up on our time. Hopefully, I can just keep you for a couple more minutes, because I also wanted to ask you. You formed a really interesting company called the BioCollective. Can you speak about that? I mean, I think that's one of the things that's seems to be I think a really powerful way of moving forward, which is kind of mapping these different microbiomes so that we're able to have a better idea of what's actually going on. How can we improve that? What are things to do? But first, really like understanding on a personal level what's going on in your own gut.
Sure. So when we initially started it, we were collecting people's samples and giving them their genetic information back. And we were building these models to try to understand what was going on. We've actually done some very interesting work in identifying some biomarkers in Parkinson's through our sample collection there. And then we've made our data available to other scientific researchers who want to kind of dig around in the data and see what they can find kind of across disease patterns. So I think we have some interesting things that'll be coming out in the next year or so from one of the researchers who's using our data. And then, we started to isolate and build a strain bank of different microbes that could be used in probiotics, either human or on the soil side. So we mostly we collected human samples, but we also did a lot of, like I said, collecting from plants or co-fermenting plants and microbes and then isolating out of there to see what kind of changes and different capabilities of the microbes we would have to kind of work with as a toolkit. And the same thing over on our soil side. We started out looking for a microbial team that could break down glyphosate and help restore soil vitality, but we've also worked on microbial groups that can break down what are called these forever chemicals, PFAS, other hydrocarbons. And microbes, I tell people all the time, like, I love microbes. They are just amazing. People with this fear mentality want to kill them, but like, no microbes, no life on this planet. They are so amazing. And like, you work with plants, I work with microbes. And maybe people think I'm a little bit kooky, but I actually talk to my microbes and I tell them, like, go help people. And that's really what the BioCollective is about, is going to help people. Like, we are a collective, and if we work together, we can have this really beautiful, supportive culture from the soil through the plants, through the animals to the humans. And it's all this really incredible regenerative system that is fueled by the microbes.
And how does that look with your company? If someone is interested in having their gut kind of mapped, they would send in a fecal sample, and then you would give them some sort of like analysis or levels, recommendations as well. What does that look
So
like?
we actually don't collect the samples anymore. We stopped collecting the samples during COVID because we collected whole stool, which has a lot of live microbes in it. And so we don't do that anymore. There are a number of companies that do it. There's a company called Nirvana Biome and Microbiome Labs. And I think there's a company called Jonah where you can do that. And they will give you some recommendations. What we also found, we sent like a 60-page report of all the details of what was in your gut, and people would take it to their doctors. And doctors don't really know a lot about the microbiome. And so, people would come back to us and go, well, they just kind of looked at me cross-eyed. And so I was spending a lot of time just helping people understand where to go look for resources and how to learn themselves. But I think we're still on the cusp of really understanding how to use that as a tool to uh, kind of improve our health, if you will. Where if we just think about restoring the ecosystem wholeness, one of the problems with trying to take a report like that and target is people kind of go back to that killing mentality of, oh, there's something there, let's try to kill it, as opposed to how do we restore balance
Yeah.
in the system.
Yeah, maybe
And
final question. We spoke just before we started. You said it at one point you were in Peru and you did your research paper on the Nazca lines. Anything you can share about that? I think that's a fascinating topic.
well, yeah, as a kid, I just found Peru incredibly fascinating. And in 2008, I decided I had stopped working and was really kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do next. So I went to Peru and worked at an orphanage in Lima for a couple of weeks. And then I had planned this trip with a friend who wasn't able to come. And so I went by myself, and I went to see the Nazca lines and is it Balestas, the islands off the where they get the guano, which of course is full of microbes, and then went to Machu Picchu and into the Sacred Valley. And I had never traveled by myself, and it was just such an incredible experience. And I was there during the rainy season, and I got to my hotel in Machu Picchu, and the power went out in town. So there was no power for the 3 days I was there. We had flashlights. But my guide came the night before we were supposed to go up, and she said, when do you want to go up? And I said, well, I'd like to go up like 5:30 in the morning because I want to see the sun come through the sun gate. And she said, oh, well, you won't see the sun come through the sun gate because it's the rainy season. There's never any sun. And I said, well, I want to try anyway. And so she came and got me at 5:30 in the morning, and it was this beautiful sunny day. And she looked at me and she said, I don't know what, she goes, but you have some powerful medicine. And so we went and we had this incredible day, and it was just a magnificent experience. And I hiked Huayna Picchu and met all these amazing people. And then the next day I went back by myself, and it just poured down rain. I was like, well, I was given a magical gift to be there on that sunny day. And then I went and spent a week in the Sacred Valley. And I just had this young guy he was kind of my private tour guide. I had a taxi, and this young man who knew all the area and the culture. And we went to the place where they have the salt pools and the spirals into, where they grew the food from the jungle up in the mountains. And, the place that I stayed had a planetarium, and I was the only person there. I mean, it was just like the most magical experience. And I have on my list to go back, but I have not been back. And, flying over those Nazca lines, just thinking about the report I did as a kid, and, you look down at that and there's so much we don't know. And there's so much knowledge and wisdom in these ancient cultures that have been discounted in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Martha. This has been amazing. I feel like I could pick your brain for another few hours, but I know we need to end this. But maybe at some point, if you're willing, we can do round two. But I think you're a fascinating woman. I really kind of applaud your story. I'm very sorry to hear about your husband, but it seems like he was able to lead an amazing life while he had time here. And I think also in the spirit of kind of a true American scientist, I think you really embody that idea of I think that the best of science, which always was by amateurs, not in a bad sense, but in a good sense, like people who really had a passion about something, drew on all sorts of different studies, which is really the basis of kind of Western knowledge, which is this kind of liberal arts idea of really drawing on all of these fields and looking at things in a holistic perspective, and drawing upon different philosophies and ways of looking at things to really have a better understanding of the whole. And I think you do that really beautifully. So thank you so much for sharing, for the work you do. If anyone is interested in kind of contacting you, learning more about you, if they're interested in the probiotic you're making, what's the best way for people to find out more, to contact you?
So they can find out about the probiotics on our BiotiQuest website, and that's BiotiQuest.com. I also have a Parkinson's blog called Martha's Quest, where I write about the microbiome and Parkinson's and other alternate, things like Qigong and energy medicine and different ways to kind of affect health outside of the Western tradition. And then if you want to know about the BioCollective, it's thebiocollective.com, and you can kind of see the history of how we've evolved in studying the microbiome and kind of where we came from. And I really appreciate you having me today. I'm actually working on an expanded version of that life bridge concept of a book. And so when I get that finished, I'd love to come back and talk to you more about that.
That'd be amazing. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for coming on again, sharing for all you're doing. I wish you the best, and thank you so much again.
Thank you, Jason. Have a great day.
All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. For me, it was really fascinating. I find all of these subjects very fascinating, also very much in alignment with the work that I do. So that's it. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really beautiful way. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers also give you different things back, things like early access to shows, some bonus material, Q&As. As always, to all the people supporting that way, thank you very much for your help. I deeply appreciate it. It's really what allows me to continue making these. And if you're able to do that, thank you very much in advance. Again, I really like the idea of that website because it's built on this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's a really helpful way to give back. If you're not able to do that, as always, helping with the algorithms is super beneficial. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. Also, as I mentioned in the intro, if you're interested in working with myself or my colleague Merav Artsy, probably when this comes out, we'll already be in our plant medicine dieta in the Sacred Valley of Peru, but we still have space left for our upcoming European retreats in the end of April in Portugal and the beginning of July in Ireland. It's a really beautiful opportunity to learn, to heal, to experience the kind of direct connection and teaching that these plants have to offer. So if you'd like to learn more about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. That's it. I have some upcoming guests. My friend Brian James, who I've interviewed a couple times, is coming back. He recently released a new book about kind of the... I think the book is called Traumadelic, and it's about kind of the overemphasis on trauma and the psychiatric model in working with plants and in these more kind of holistic or indigenous systems. I think it's a super fascinating and important topic, so he'll be coming on. I have a few other people coming on. Again, I'm not sure the exact order, so I probably won't say quite yet, just to make sure that they're all verified and confirmed. But as always, I hope to bring on some really fascinating guests. So I hope this finds you all well. Again, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the support, and I will see you all on the next episode.
To